Hey, some thoughts to share with you. Um, yeah, sometimes there are all kind of things that come up, and I thought to try and see how it goes. So, something that came up is spiritual people and not spiritual people. Many times people define me as a spiritual person. Sometimes as a hippie, sometimes as many times as a strange person. Um, all kinds of labels, of definitions. And I don't perceive myself as a spiritual person, basically. And maybe it's to go to what is spirituality. What is it? Like, what defines a person as spiritual? So, as I understand it, spiritual people or spiritual perception is like between there is material, which says everything is matter, and there is the spiritual that says, yeah, there is the material world, but there is a higher world above, which is the spiritual, which is like the mind, or the where even sometimes it says beyond the mind. And of course, there are many philosophical approaches and there are many automatic approaches as well that are not thought quite into the depth of what does it really mean. Um, but maybe as a generalization, of course, what I mostly meet, those who define themselves as spiritual and have the spiritual fashion look and all these things. It's many times people with what is called in philosophy the dualistic perception, which can be kind of parallel to there is the body and the soul. Like it's two different types of existence that happen simultaneously. The eternal soul is made out of different type of energy than the physical body, which is a different type of energy. So that is like dualistic because there are two types of material that are completely different, and it's like different world. And the thing is, there is a philosophical obstacle or trap in that approach, because how can two completely different, essentially different types of existences affect each other? How can the consciousness influence matter or matter influence consciousness? Some say it's just the mind over matter, some say it's both ways. And of course, the material say there is only one basic essential energy, and it is the material energy, and consciousness is based on that, evolving from the complexity of the associative cortex, and it's also in a way lacking understanding or clarity, and there is not so much support also through science, which is the empirical official tool of the material perception. Um, and it's kind of two dominant approaches that exist largely. There are many other approaches, and my approach is one of the many others. And in a way, I think there is one fundamental energy or substance or essence that everything is made of, including consciousness, including matter. And this energy is same, it's material. Actually, it's not spiritual, because as I understand spiritual, it's not material. But if spiritual is also material, so it's also spiritual, and it's just semantic of definition, and it doesn't matter if we call it material or spiritual. And there the definition of a person as material or spiritual falls, basically. Or not material, but because materialism is more specific perception, but as a spiritual person, that definition falls if spirituality includes materiality. Spiritual. As I understand it, there is also maybe to another thing before that, very commonly perceived as the internal experience and the external experience. So the external is the sensory, the internal is like our imagination, our emotions and feelings, the inner world, what is called. So I find it as a myth and misunderstanding of existence. In my perception, there is no internal world. It's all external. And of course, some what is considered to be spiritual approaches also say that. And material, of course, say that. And therefore, because it's of course saying it, I am siding with the material perception around that. But the conventional materialism kind of say, yeah, it's just subjective experience that is not as significant. And also, again, with not so clear understanding of what are emotion, how it works, what are thoughts, how it works. So specifically, these two things actually are what weaving the psyche mostly, or there are three things that what the inner world is made from. And it's kind of classic approach and like intuitively many times interpreted in this way. So there are the identification with this body, which includes the five senses, so everything that I can imagine as an imprint, like I see something with my eyes and then I can imagine it, so now it's internally. So it kind of copy-paste of something I see, and I can edit it and create new images with imagination. And then there are the emotions and the thoughts, which are two more strings that are weaving the tapestry of the psyche. Like three types of strings: physical, emotional, mental. I guess most of you heard this distinguishment as these two planes or layers or aspects and so on. So as I perceive it, it's not like that. It's just that's how we interpret it. But actually, there are these 5 senses which are generalized as the physical, and there are 5 out of 7 senses. There are 2 more. There is the pacemaker, which sends electromagnetic field. The brain have actual sensor like nerve that goes out and a sensor that sends electromagnetic fields. We're just not acknowledging that sensor. Therefore, we interpret it only as if it's not an external input, physical, it's not, only internal. It's part of the delusion. Because visual or any other, we can experience as an external input or internal. But electromagnetic fields, we experience only as internal, and we interpret them as emotions and feelings, and like feeling of presence can be as well, and so on. But it's basically an energy that is measurable physically with technological devices, and it's the same energy that was referred by civilization that in the past that have explored it and were acknowledging it. Very common names for it is prana in the Vedanta tradition, or chi in China, and so on. I mean, every tribe have a name for that. In Hawaii, they call it mana, or life force. It's life force, basically. It's electromagnetic energy, essentially electric, creating magnetic field as well. We can experience it as erotic, or as sadness, or as heart opening, or any like peacefulness. And it's a sensor. Like, we come to a place, we feel it, this place feels to me like that and that, because I sense it with the pacemaker, like the heart sensor in a way, maybe to say. Same, I feel there is someone there having a certain feeling towards me, and I turn and I see, oh, there is actually someone there looking at me, and so on. Like, there are many possible examples. I'm sure most of you have examples for explaining that. And in a way, it allows objective perception upon our emotions, just to acknowledge the fact there is that sensor. So that is one sensor that weaves the emotional together with the physical. But then there is the mental, or physical, emotional, mental, or it can be thoughts, like body, feelings, thoughts, or I saw many. But what is thoughts? What is mental? So it's another sensor. Some of us know, many of us don't know, but these eyes, the 2 eyes, we actually have another eye physically, literally, with a pupil and an iris, and it receives electromagnetic waves like these, what we call light, in a longer wavelength, like more towards radio waves. But we don't see that eye because it's inside. And interestingly, it's exactly that sensor that is inside the brain, the middle of the brain. It's called the pineal gland, by the way. The pupil points up. It's exactly in the middle of the brain. But the pineal sensor or gland and the pacemaker both are sensors that are inside the skin. So it just shows how dominant is that sensor on our understanding of ourselves. kind of, if I don't see it, I don't believe it exists. So these two sensors, I don't see it, I don't believe it exists. But actually, there is a sensor, and it's that sensor that is in the middle, that is actually more dominant in the experience of self. And self in what can be considered to be a spiritual aspect or in an abstract aspect. Because in an emotional aspect, this is me. We also say I, me. We point towards where that sensor is because it's the center of the field we generate, of the presence, of the feelings, of the experience. But there is me that is pure consciousness and can be objective witness on the experience more than any, more than the visual me, more than the eyes that look. It's another eye. And another difference between that eye and these eyes, it's that in that eye there are silica crystals organized in sheets, very thin sheets, exactly like transistors basically. And it's work in a way like transistor. It receives electromagnetic wave. The pupil is like the antenna. The fluid in the skull is like the prism that breaks the light in the wavelength directed to the center of the brain. It's open. There is no brain covering it up. Especially when we are born, we have that bone also open, so we receive more input in a way, and then it closes. But these crystals inside, they work as transistors. It's exactly the technology that basically we work with our internet, smartphones, computers, satellites. Radio technology is the basis of all that, is to send a signal upon a light wave or electromagnetic wave, and the coding on that wave is actually the information that is interpreted and decoded from the crystal into electric charge that electrifies the brain, and the brain is conducting the electricity, neurotransmitters, all that thing, which is more familiar in the materialistic perception. So it's another sensor, and the same like this sensor, the heart sensor, because it's not acknowledged, the input is not perceived objectively as if it is something external. It's just perceived as subjectively, like it's my inner world, my thoughts, my imagination, my mind. But there is no my thoughts, it's just thoughts. And this is like an antenna, and I can think this radio channel or this radio channel, I can tune to where, and it's available for everyone. But this sensor is largely damaged, like the fluoride calcified and break these crystals, mercury and aluminum also calcify it, and some other heavy metals, and yeah, fluoride is maybe the worst, over chlorine as well. So it's damaged in a way. It's like we see through a broken glass, so we see less clear. And there is much, it's actually fascinating, but in a way, through that sensor, we can, because the data that comes, the input that comes through that sensor, the data is more dimensional than any other sensor, so it can in a way contain all the input from the other sensors. So we can imagine even how light behaves, and sound and smell and taste and touch and feelings. We can imagine all that. We can use that one sensor kind of to include all the others in one. And this is a lot what we experience through dreaming, for example. And of course, many other phenomena that are considered as supernatural can be explained in that way quite easily. Yeah, it's just because it's not acknowledged. So both, like, same like satellites work with physical energy, and same like magnets work with electromagnetic field, and this body also work like this is what we experience as thoughts and mind and imagination and feelings and emotions. It's physical energy. It can be measured, and that energy would be more difficult to measure, but even that can be measured in some ways. And what is left, basically, if everything is physical, also, I mean, the feelings and thoughts, it's all physical. So what is beyond physical? So we can go into the, okay, who is I that witness my thoughts and my feelings and my body with all its other sensory input, and understanding it's not it's just thoughts and feelings and a body, and that pure awareness that is distilled from subjective experience, that distilled from thinking and feeling and so on. And what is that witness? So the last piece to hold on to is a self, which a self, basically, it can be summarized as a singularity. It's actually just a singularity experiencing all that combination of 7 sensory, and including also the motoric aspect, the action. So it have like 8 gates to experience reality, and that's it. That contains all the psyche and the physical experience. It's all physical, it's all external. The internal is just that singularity, that same like the pupil cannot look into itself directly, only through a reflection, same that singularity cannot be aware of itself directly, only through the reflection of the wholeness. And that singularity can be perceived as differentiated from a singularity that is even more essential, which, if to go all the way, the only singularity of existence that experience itself through every possible self. And even that is a perception that comes from a self, from a person, from a single being that might project the self on that absolute. And there, even that dissolves. And there is no self. It's just a phenomena of awareness through an experience that is happening. But it's all physical and spiritual, it's the same. But the most fundamental energy that builds the physical world is information. This is also the data, the input that this sensor receives, the pineal sensor. It's basically it's information coded on the light waves. And information, in a way, can be open and flow and be perceived as something that is not single, not specific, and it can move in a loop. Kind of like in the string theory, there can be an open string, which is just information, and there can be a closed string that is connected to itself. And then it can experience a separation from the everythingness, which is unlimited only by dimensionality. And that is in a way singularity, a string that connects to itself. And it's just the only difference is how the information is flowing. If the information is flowing back to itself, it's a self. If the information flow from here to there, it's just existence. And that's the only difference. And therefore it's all physical in a way, but in a way that is beyond the five senses. It's actually seven senses physical. And the sense that is in a way the most inclusive one, that can include all the others, or the integrating sense, is what we experience as the mind or thoughts and so on. And this is in a way a link to know by rationality, by understanding myself as the absolute self that experiences itself through this specific self, as well as any other self and every possible self. And Buddha said all is mind. So it can contradict many of New Age approaches that I meet, that it's to go, they say go beyond the mind. Beyond the mind exists something else, like the truth. But in Buddha's perception there is no beyond mind, because all is mind, but all is one mind, the Buddha mind. And it's kind of equivalence to that, but as well Buddha's approach was not spiritual, but actually scientific. Spiritual, I mean, in that sense, based on belief system. He was more an experimenter and a researcher that explored consciousness, how can suffer be solved, or how can we integrate that experience, and kind of to this direction, instead of saying God said like that and you must believe. So it's different type of spirituality. Today's it is defined as spirituality because it's not the conventional materialistic, so it can be degraded as a spiritual with its credibility, or like seriousness of why it is so, rationality. But it goes to a deeper logic that the materialistic perception ignores, and the quantum physics even just already breaks the material perception, but it works and it comes from material perception. And that's why physicists commonly say that it cannot be understood, and if you think you understand quantum physics, then you don't, and so on. Because from a material perception, it just does not make sense. It defies materialism. It defies the fundamental of the perception that try to use that theory and have created that theory as well. But it's using math, and mathematics is not exactly considered to be natural science. It can be considered as science, but it can also be considered as different faculty, like more spiritual, more like philosophy, like There are some mathematics that go into the art of mathematics, like into axiomatics, research of mathematic symmetries, just as an ideas and so on. And how I perceive it, actually, this is even more science. And therefore, it works so well with the physics and chemistry and biology and sciences that are more needing a affirmation or confirmation from the material world. It works so well because the nature of numbers, we in a way we can invent a way to describe a number, and the way we write the marks and so on, but we discover the quality of the numbers when we go and explore the mathematics. We did not invent everything. We're actually exploring it. And this is a science that explores, maybe to say, the matrix itself, the code that everything is made of. And therefore, the physical world, what we know as physical, so much resonate with it. And even more complex physical world, like Einstein theories of relativity, or quantum theory, or more new stuff that is fascinating and appearing. And in a way, the characteristics of the numbers themselves, and it's worth going into also what is a number in the first place and how it is defined, and like all the way to the zero, how we define the zero as the base of everything. And it shows in a way the peak of the perception that we can upon reality from a rational perception, from the purest possible logic that we can define and communicate. And even if to say other life in other planets and so on, let's say visiting Earth, what would be the chances that the ET that is arriving here will understand English better than mathematics? Most likely, mathematics would be the most understood language for the ET from all the languages on the planet, because it's making sense, because it's more logic, like more rational. There are no exceptions that are traditionally kept. There are so many irrationalities in cultural languages. So it's actually kind of waste of mental energy to it's by itself in a way limiting us to go further and communicate even more directly with one precise meaning, and not a sentence that can be interpreted in 5 different ways and can create misunderstanding when one person thinks the other understand in that way, but actually it's not. Although it can, of course, be used in art as poetry to bring deeper meaning, and when there is deep sentiments to the culture and tradition that it comes from, and it can bring into glory some cultural ideas, which is expression of beauty, as our ability as humans to create these things. But in the more practical aspect, it is less practical, and we have both sides, and it's good to develop both sides, not only one, of course. And what is largely not included in those who are considered to be spiritual, it's that rational side. So there is much leaning on the intuitive perception that follows beauty rather than the rational, that is efficient. And the material is more leaning on the efficient side, like at least those who lead the material move, because the majority is not as enthusiast usually, and just go with the stream. But the material kind of at least try to be more rational, but it's not as inclusive. It's not including consciousness, which is the missing piece eventually after the most advanced theories. And of course there are theories that can mathematically show a model that includes consciousness, and this is in my perception new science that is integrated, that is physical and spiritual at the same time. It's dissolving that distinguishment between science and spirituality, and it's actually science, the scientific approach towards the experience, towards the subjective experience, and to take the subjective experience and objectify, to merge the difference between objective and subjective, seeing it as two interpretations of the same thing and figuring the thing itself. That is basically what I think about. So I don't know how to call it yet. I can try to guess some possibilities. Rational materialism, or scientific rational science. I mean, because eventually science is the approach, but it is still limited to our ability to interpret the things. And the mind, as Buddha said, like this mind, not the mind that is looped, that we identify with, but the absolute mind, the Buddha mind, is, I can see how it is. All that is, we can say, is the field of information, or the matrix, or the code in a way itself, figuring out itself through everything. And I find it actually much more interesting, because now I need to use sharp logic to understand even more reality and myself. And through myself, which is the most available gate, I can understand the essence, the source of everything, that Buddha mind. And Buddha mind as well, just to define a term that, yeah, the spiritual world have given it a term. And the science did not give it so much a term, but the matrix can work, although it's coming from a movie and from a certain art and not an official definition of science, but it can be that as well. Because in a way it is type of a matrix. Like everything is connected to everything in every possible way, and even the distinguishment between thing and no thing is intertwined, and kind of it ends in a certain paradox, that from that paradox a self appears that experience the not self, which is a paradox, but that is experience. And the fact it is a paradox does not mean it does not exist. It just means that that's how it is perceived to us. And yeah, expanding the perception into integrating and containing it can be an interesting journey to those who want that. But it is in a way an answer to whoever defines me as spiritual or as something like that. So yeah, I don't see myself as spiritual. I more actually not so much defining myself, but in order to interact with people, so in a more efficient way, it's good to define myself, and I'm working on it. It's not easy because associations are yeah, it's this language is not as accurate. If I could just say zero in the mathematics sense, that would be the most direct point towards self, but it does not explain the gap of understanding what I mean when I say zero. The subjective experience is not necessarily so clear. A singularity, a point in the matrix. But then when I come as a human, kind of go out of the abstract ego into an ego with a persona and meet you as a person. So yeah, I don't define myself as spiritual. I define myself as practical and as an research, like scientifically researching this world, trying to understand it. And I'm open-minded to, as much as I succeed and I try if I can be more, to any possibility. I perceive imagination as a tool to perceive what is, and I think everything that can be imagined exists physically in a more dimensional physics than 3. And I'm just, fortunately, I am curious to understand and to explore. But my approach is scientific and practical. And what I find as spiritual meant usually, it's actually someone who is less in the practical and more in the, like, the head in the clouds, that saying, and without feet on the ground. But as I see it, most people don't really have the feet in the ground. Most people are not connected to their wild nature. Most people don't know themselves, the animal self. They don't know that. They live patterns and habits and social agreements as like domesticated animals, which lost the ground actually and are in a certain horizontal affirmation connection and forgot the fundamental elements that build this body, forgot the importance of how to be in a body, and more trapped in a mind. I think that, I need something like money, it's a common one, or even deeper into the complexification and ungrounding, I need material stuff to feel happy, like nice clothes, I need or jewelry, or to look like this or like that, or like all these stuff is actually, I see it not, it's like the head is more stuck somewhere and the feet are not on the ground, and it's stuck in like the what the there are some forces that make a lot of money from all the consuming, like people buy all this stuff. Some people make a lot of money from it, and there is no regulation of what commercials are allowed or not. Like, we are bombarded with commercials, and if they see people buying, they just put more, and they study with AI the mind of the person to even buy more and more, consume more, and just keeps the person further and further from its nature. And the nature is always available. It's kind of like waiting for us to land, to like stop keeping ourselves in the air by a long fart and stop farting and landing on the earth and feeling earth, nature. Like, we are earth, we are part of nature, we are nature. It's like it's the same thing. And feeling it, not to be a human above animals, like plants, animals, and humans, as if it is like something better or something above. No, it's just another animal with the most evolved prefrontal cortex, which allow abstract definition and many applications that come from it, but it's just another animal, part of this planet. And part of the application is to define an ego, to define self, which is an ego. So there is the human ego that defines itself as separate. We are expert in it more than any other animal, but it's just a cognitive function. But we can use it to know ourselves even deeper, to know the essence of self, the source, or what Buddha called the Buddha mind. But we can know that as happening through us, all of us, and then we know our connectivity. We are all the same one. But when we don't lift the head high enough to realize that essence, so yeah, we will believe we are separated, and we will compete for survival, because we will be thinking that, oh, we actually, biology is for survival and not for living together, for diversity of expressions of consciousness. We will less enjoy life, basically, less enjoy the magic of nature, of just being and experiencing this wow of being. And it's available all the time for all of us. Even just to inhale and exhale, that can be amazing feeling. But we need to go to a workshop to remember to breathe and enjoy it, many of us. And many of us even don't go to that. They just focus on something else that they think even further that will bring them the fulfillment and happiness. So yeah, it's like to be like on earth is to be part of nature. That's how I perceive it. And naturally it grows the head above the clouds and see the pure light, metaphorically. Know the essence. Know that the planet is happening through us. And we are not a separate being that come to the planet and see what I want, what I don't want. No, I am part of it. I'm a one cell. This human is one cell in this superorganism that is called Earth. And each one of you as well. Like, we are the prefrontal cortex of the planet. And we can create connections and increase intelligence, or we can create separation, cut connection, and create Alzheimer to the planet, Or even many metaphorize how human on the planet as cancer, like the planet have a brain cancer. with all the concrete that destroys the wood, the forest, the like nature, the cities, and so on. Yeah, just some thoughts, and almost an hour. I'll see where I upload it, but I guess I put it on YouTube, and I start with that. Peace.